আমি তো আমার এনপিটিএল ক্লাসটা স্টার্ট হবে তাই বসে আছি এখন। হ্যাঁ, ৭টা থেকে ঠিক আছে, এখনো স্টার্ট হয়নি। এই আর ১০-১৫ মিনিট আগেই এলাম, আজকে আর স্ন্যাক্স করতে যাইনি। হ্যাঁ, ওখানে আমি চা খেয়ে নিয়েছি, চা আর বিস্কিট। হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, আজকে একটু মাথা ধরেছে, আশা করছি পারবো না। তাও অনেক কমেছে গো। মানে জুন যেরকম হচ্ছিল প্রায় উইকে ২-৩ বার করে করে, এখন অনেকটা কমেছে, সেরকম হচ্ছে না। ধুর, ওটাতে কোনো কাজ হয়নি, ওটাতে কোনো ডিফারেন্স হয়নি। ৩ মাস খেলাম, তার মধ্যে যা তা হয়েছে, কখনো বেশি হয়েছে, কখনো কম হয়েছে। তাই ওটা আর খাবো না ভাবছি। না, ওটা অ্যাকচুয়ালি না, ওটা শ্রেয়সী এরকম আমাকে আরেকটা নিউরোলজিস্ট দেখাতো। এখন শ্রেয়সী বলে যে ওর এবং মাইগ্রেনের ওষুধ ও সারা জীবনই খেয়ে গেছে, যেগুলো তোর অ্যাকচুয়ালি কাজ হয়। ওটা কিছুদিন পরে রেজিস্ট্যান্স হয়ে যায়, ওকে চেঞ্জ করতে হয়েছে কিছু বছর পর। আমি তো কোনোদিনই সেটা পাইনি। তো ও একটা নিউরোলজিস্টের কথা বলবে বলেছিল, ওর মানে কলকাতারই। সে কাছে আমরা গিয়ে দেখবো, হ্যাঁ। মানে ওর কিন্তু এরকম আমার মতন এত ফ্রিকুয়েন্ট হয় না। ও সবসময় একটা এরকম ডেইলি মেডিসিনে থাকে বলে। হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, সেটা সেটা দেখ, সেটা জিজ্ঞেস করতে হবে ওকে। আবার থেকে না, যেটা সে কাজ করেছিল সেই ডাক্তার কি দেখায়। হুম, সেটাই সেটাই সেটাই। হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, ঠিক ঠিক। ১ সেকেন্ড দাঁড়াও। না না, ১ সেকেন্ড দাঁড়াও। We'll start in 2 3 minutes.
Hi, ma'am. Good evening.
Good evening. Okay, we'll start the class. This is the second TA session for design of steel structures taught by Professor Damodar Maiti. I am Trisha Chakravarti, one of the course teaching assistants. I'm a PhD student at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. I'll start with a brief recap of the basic concepts of steel design that we covered last class. There are two broad branches of structural engineering: analysis and design. Analysis is the forward problem. So, in analysis, we would be given the structural dimension, boundary conditions, applied loads. So, we know everything about the structure, and we want to find out the response induced in the structure, which can response can be in terms of forces or stresses, or deflections or strains. And in design it is the inverse problem. So we are given the loads that has to be withstood by the structure and some criteria on maximum deflection. So the loads I have to do with the collapse limit states, and the maximum deflection etc are related to the serviceability limit states. And we are for design we are given those loads, and we are given some constraints, like some we cannot come up with all the boundary conditions ourselves because there will be some architectural considerations. And then first we have to carry out an analysis, like we have to find the optimum size of structural elements. How do we do that? We assume some size of the element and some material properties, and then we carry out an analysis. Given these we are given these loads, so we take these loads, we take an as our assumed structure, structural dimension and material, and then we carry out an analysis. So we get the response in the structure, and then we see that is the response that is going to be induced by the structure for these loads in a good enough that like, is my structure good enough to take those loads. So design analysis are not exactly opposites, they are more like two parts of structural design. One second. Yes, Srinivas Balaji, you have a question?
Yes, ma'am. Actually, is it possible to record this meeting?
Yes, actually, these meetings are recorded and I upload them in YouTube, and the link should be available to you. But in case it is not, I'll share my profile with you. I upload
Okay, ma'am.
lectures at the end of each class.
Okay, ma'am. Thanks.
So, so analysis and design, even though analysis is called the forward problem and design the inverse problem, they are not really opposites of each other. They are two branches, and we need analysis for design. And the purpose of learning analysis is because we ultimately, as structural engineers, we want to design structures. And so steel versus concrete is always a debate because it there are a lot of factors to be considered, and in some cases concrete is more economically viable, in some cases steel is. Concrete is the most versatile material for construction because concrete can be cast into any shape we want so long as we have the formwork. But then why should we use steel? Because steel is much stronger than conventional concrete. I spoke about this in the last class. As you would have studied in RCC structures already, that concrete, even in concrete structures, we have steel reinforcements inside the concrete. Why do we have that? Because concrete has no strength and tension. Its entire strength is compressive. So to take the tension, we have to give steel anyway. So we do that, like we carry out analysis and we see that in which parts of the structure we expect tension to appear, there we put the reinforcements. We don't generally put it all along the section. For in a bending in a beam, in a simply supported beam, if it is bending like this, so we know that the bottom fibers will be under tension, so we put the steel reinforcement in the bottom, while near the supports there might be a hogging moment. So if the structure might be like this, so there will be tension on the top fibers and we will put steel reinforcements in the top. But that is concrete structures with steel reinforcements. But steel is because steel concrete has no strength and tension at all, but even in compression steel is much stronger. So steel as a whole is much stronger than conventional concrete. High strength to weight ratio because steel is also very lightweight. And as we talked last class, the steel sections, the dimensions that we deal with in steel is much lesser. Like few millimeter thickness for a steel section is quite realistic, while in concrete, I think in the codes the minimum dimension of one side of the column has to be 250 so there is a huge difference in the dimension, the cross sectional dimensions also. So steel structures are much lightweight, and compared and considering that steel has a high strength to weight ratio, steel is also ductile compared to concrete. This is another factor that you can never emphasize enough, because ductility is so important in a structure. Ductility means that even after yielding, even when the structure is nearing failure, it will give us a lot of warning. So warning comes in the term of rapid deformation. So in steel we see the stress strain curve. So in the stress strain curve of steel, we have seen in last class that it even after yielding, the strain can increase to a large extent, and the stress increases much lesser. But that strain increment is important for us, because if my structure has some element has reached yielding and then it is deforming rapidly, so we can see that it is about to fail, something is going to happen. So especially in case of extreme conditions like earthquake or wind loading, especially earthquakes, if we see if the structure fails slowly, it gives warning, and there is falling of concrete and all that, then we will have time to evacuate, because the first we want the structure not to collapse at all, but if the structure is about to collapse, we would want first to save human lives. So ductility is that the fact that steel is more ductile than concrete is a factor in its favor. And even in RCC design, where we in the when in the design, if you look at the design criteria in IS, uh, what is it, IS 456, you'll see that we want the steel reinforcement to fail before the concrete does. Because if concrete fails first, it will be an immediate collapse with no warning time. And however, steel is much costlier than concrete, so that is a main roadblock in using steel everywhere. So generally, residential and institutional buildings we see around us are majorly constructed of concrete. It's the critical structures where we go for steel. And why do we need design? This whole course is about design. So we need design because the components individually and the entire structure should withstand the load throughout its lifespan, satisfying serviceability criteria. Withstanding the load is the collapse limit state, ultimate limit state, and serviceability criteria are generally the deflection criteria. And there is a lifespan. Now we cannot guarantee that a structure will withstand all loads for forever. So we generally put a lifespan on they put a time limit after which it will require major repair and all, because the materials which we are constructing it with today will undergo some fatigue loading, lose some strength, and it might behave differently 10 years, 20 years from now. So we have to generally the we have a lifespan for 50 years for residential buildings and 75 years for bridges or commercial buildings. So after that, there should we should hire like a structural health monitor. Uh, we should hire a civil engineer who will and do a structural health monitoring and suggest where and how we need the major repair, because we don't generally pull down the structure after 50 years and build it, because again there are economic constraints. So we can address the places where there is issues. And to properly design a structure, we have to ensure that it is economical to construct without compromising safety. This is cost effective design. So we cannot make a structure like we cannot make it infinitely safe. Like you see the columns and beams around you. If you made the column, if you give a larger cross section of the columns and beams, firstly it would affect the utility. Plus it would also make it much more, it will make the structure safer, but the expensive, it will become much more expensive. So there is and the purpose of building residential or commercial buildings is that people should be able to afford it and use it. Otherwise there is no profit in the builder. So there are a lot of other factors apart from safety, and for that we need cost effective design. And only when we know all the design procedure in detail, we'll be able to, as structural engineers, we will be able to find out the best way that where there is a certain level of safety is maintained and we are able to reduce the cost of it. Mechanical properties of steel. Physical properties of structural steel as detailed by clause 2.2.4.1 of IS 800/2007, the Indian Standard Code for Steel Design. Irrespective of its grade, there are five properties which are mentioned. That the density, the unit mass, is denoted by rho, that is 7850 kg per meter cube. Modulus of elasticity, or the Young's modulus, which is the initial slope of the stress strain curve during by during its linear regime, is denoted by E. It is 2 into 10 to the power 5 Newton per millimeter square. This unit, Newton per millimeter square, is actually megapascal, because Pascal is the SI unit, Newton per meter square. And since there is millimeter square in the denominator, a 10 to the power 6 factor comes. Because in the denominator there is a 10 to the power minus 6 factor. So in the numerator it becomes 10 to the power 6 Pascal, that is megapascal. And I'm saying this because this is a unit we encounter very frequently in questions. So stick to the unit system. A lot of people even at this age may make mistakes about units, because it's because it seems a very trivial issue, but you should always calculate in everything. You should stick to megapascal or stick to pascal, stick to SI unit. That is the safest thing. Poisson's ratio mu is 0.3. Modulus of rigidity G is the shear modulus. It is 0.769 into 10 to the power 5 megapascal, and the coefficient of thermal expansion alpha is 12 into 10 to the power minus 6 per degree centigrade. But these are properties that are generally not used in design directly, even though we might need it in some other places. But generally in the design procedure in the step by step whatever we do, we generally don't need this. We need these two properties. The principal mechanical properties of structural steel important in design are the yield stress Fy and the tensile or ultimate stress Fu, which we get from the stress strain curve. So stress in this stress strain curve, as we discussed in the last class in quite detail, this is a linear regime up to A. Then so this the slope of this part, this origin to A part is the Young's modulus. A to B is the linear. It is a curved. It is a curved path. It is not really linear, but up to B, B is the elastic limit. So if we load a structure up to B, like up to this stress corresponding to B, and then remove the stress entirely, the strain will go back to zero. So it will regain its original configuration. Then after B there is another curved path leading up to C or D, which are generally very close space. That is the yield point. And now up to the yield point, from the elastic limit to the yield point, what happens is, even if we remove the stress entirely, the strain does not go back to zero. So there will be some permanent set or permanent deformation in my structure, in my structural element. So C is this stress corresponding to C or D, or maybe its average. This is the Fy, the yield strength. Yield stress or yield strength, you can say, both are equally applicable. Fy in general, like generally it's around 250 MPa in steel. There are of course a lot of grades of steel, and see, okay, this is an important point. Here these five properties are saying that irrespective of its grade, we might take all of these five as constants, but yield stress and ultimate stress heavily depend on the grade of steel you are using. So in one grade, if Fe 410, 250 is the yield stress. Then after this yield point, the material starts to there is a sharp decrease in the slope of the curve. So for a small increase in stress, there is a rapid increase in strain. So after that, E is the ultimate stress point, because you can see that it is the highest point in the curve, and the stress is plotted on the y-axis. So E has the maximum stress, and in Fe for 410, the ultimate stress is 410. Then after that, after E, we cannot really use the structure anymore, because we have to consider it has failed, because even without increase in stress, the strain increases, and then it eventually fails. It eventually fractures at F. But for our purpose, we can consider E as the failure point. It fractures at F, but after E there is no use of the structure anymore. It will just go and fail. But that is not up. C or D is not that point where after that we don't have any use. After C or D, there is a reduction in the stiffness. Stiffness is generally stressed by strain. So since the slope has reduced, there is a decrease in the stiffness, but still it keeps on increasing the stress capacity. So we can load it beyond the yield point. That is the whole point of limit state method, which we'll look at today in details. Okay, so and these are the point. A is the limit of proportionality, the point where the linear nature of the stress strain graph ceases. B is the elastic limit, the limiting point for the condition that material behaves elastically, but Hooke's law does not apply. So the linear relationship is not in there anymore. For practical purposes, it can be assumed that limit of proportionality and elastic limits are the same. Beyond elastic limit, there will be some permanent deformation or permanent set when the load is removed. That is that residual strain. C and D are the upper yield point and lower yield point. They are also very close by. They can be assumed to be the same point. Points after which strain increases without correspondingly high increase in load or stress. Without correspondingly high, that means that the slope has reduced, but stress is still increasing. You have to keep that in mind. And E is the ultimate or maximum tensile stress, point when necking starts. Necking is a phenomena where this shows in this diagram, where when it is about to fail, there is a rapid decrease in the cross sections in some cross section in some parts, and that is where it will fracture. So like it will fracture generally occurs at one or 2 points in a structure. It does not, like, it breaks and then the things fall. It does not like splinter apart. So the point where there is some kind of stress concentration, and that is the point which is weakest. So the cross sectional area reduces rapidly, which is called necking, and then eventually it will fracture. F is the fracture point where the material breaks. Okay, and these are the rolled steel sections that we looked at in the last class. The IS handbook number 1 in the there is a tabulation in SP6. The Bureau of Indian Standards (BIS) publishes that, which tabulates the weight per unit length, geometric dimensions, and other dimensions for various types of steel sections. They are more standardized than in concrete. In concrete, the dimensions are really up to the structural engineer. They can put any dimension, like any practical dimension. But in steel design, we generally go with existing sections because they are factored ready-made in the industry, and they are brought and assembled at the construction site. So this is an eye section, rolled eye section. It is these horizontal parts are called the flange, and this is called the beam. Generally, in design, we do it like the flange takes most of the bending, and the web takes most of the shear. In beam design, because you know that beams in concrete design of beams, you would have seen that shear and bending are the two criteria of design. So rolled channel. This is a C section. This is These are the flanges and this is the web. Then there are angle sections with where the two legs might be equal or unequal. And this is the T section, this is the flange and this is the web. And there are some others like square hollow section, rectangular hollow section, circular hollow section. And bars, flats and plates, which are solid sections, but they're very tiny compared to the concrete sections that we see. This might be a 15 by 15 or 15 by 20 millimeter thing, and this thickness in the flats and plates would also be like 10, 15, 20, out of that range. While as I said, in columns, for example, in IS 456, the minimum dimension has to be, I think, 250 or 300, and the other dimension can be even larger, and generally it is larger. So 300 by 500 millimeter is a very common dimension in columns. You will see for concrete buildings, concrete structures, but for steel that is unthinkable. 500 by 300, 300 by 500 millimeter a steel section is literally unthinkable. So there's a difference in order of magnitude of these dimensions generally. This is just for visualization. Okay, so now we move on to the new topics of today, which is we basically look at the design philosophies. So for design, we first have to identify the modes of failure in the structure. Like in concrete beams, mostly it's bending and shear. In steel beams, there are some additional modes that we have to see. So first is bending. The gravity loading gives rise to bending of beam. This causes longitudinal stresses to be developed in the beam. So we know that bending happens when transverse loading is applied. What is transverse loading? So the beam has a suppose take as something like this. So this is the cross section, and this is the length of the beam. So this is the cross section, and this is the length. So anything along the length is called an axial loading, and anything perpendicular to that is called the transverse loading. So the transverse loading is actually parallel to the cross section. So this is a that kind. Sorry, just give me. Sorry about that. So this is a transverse loading which gives rise to bending. So what happens is when unloaded, the beam is straight, like this cross section is completely straight. The axis of the beam remains straight. Then when s- then when we gradually increase this load, this it starts bending like this. So if this is just a simply supported beam with a gravity loading that is in the downward direction. So when it starts to bend, we can you can visualize that the top fibers are compressing and the bottom fibers are elongating, and there will be one section in the middle somewhere which is called the neutral axis, where there is no which remains unelongated or uncompressed. So that is, since it is this in this profile is like it there is compression on one side and tension on the other side. The compression is maximum at the topmost fiber and the tension is maximum at the bottommost fiber, and it is a linear profile. So in it till the plastic till it is elastic and then partially see till it is elastic, this is a straight line profile. So this is the compression, then it reduces, becomes zero at the neutral axis, then it becomes tension, it increases and is maximum at the bottommost point, bottommost fiber. Then as plasticity introduced, that is the section starts to plastify from the top and bottom where the stresses are maximum, compressive and tensile. So this starts becoming a straight. This is Fy is the yield stress. It has started to yield, and then when it is fully plastic, there is the entire thing is in Fy. The entire thing has yielded. That there is a plastic hinges formed. So anyway, bending, the gravity load gives rise to bending of beam. This causes longitudinal stresses to be developed in the beam. As the bending moment increases, these flexural means bending. These flexural stresses increase further till they reach yield stress. At a certain point, either the steel is in tension and or is in compression. At this stage of loading, the beam section becomes plastic, fails by formation of a plastic hinge at the location of maximum moment being induced by the loading. Okay, so then another mode of failure of beam is local buckling. This is buckling is an issue which is generally only relevant for steel structures, because buckling happens in slender structures where the length slender, you know the English word slender. It's a very tall structure which has a very smaller cross section compared to it. So that is slenderness. And concrete structures generally have a lot larger cross section, so they are generally not, there is a slenderness ratio which we know that like there is a way to calculate it, where if the slenderness ratio crosses a certain limit, it has a tendency to buckle and all. So in concrete beams, it's concrete elements that slenderness ratio is never generally crossed, but in steels, since the cross sections are much smaller, that is an issue. So what is local buckling? During the bending process, if the compression flange or a part of the web is subjected to compression, is too thin to take any appreciable amount of compression, then the plate may fail due to buckling or rippling even before the full plastic moment is reached. So the thing that is happening is, see, I'm applying the load like this. So the compression is developing in this the top fibers, and then the bending is a phenomenon that is being undertaken by the entire beam as a whole. But local buckling, what is happening is when I'm applying a load at this point, this tiny section, this part is undergoing so much compression that this is buckling itself before the compression and tension has even reached the rest of the beam. So it is a local phenomenon. That is why it's called local buckling. It's just that this flange, generally the beams are placed like basically. Okay, so if it is suppose it's a T section, so the cross section will be like this, right? The cross section will be like this. This is the length of the beam. This is the cross section, and there will be a loading on top of this. There is a loading. So generally, it's the flange that takes the loading directly. So the flange has the most probability of undergoing local buckling, and then if from the flange it transfers to the web, so the top part of the web might also undergo that. And buckling is a phenomenon that is only relevant in case of compression. You can imagine a very, like take a very a straw or something, a very thin straw, and if you pull like try to elongate it with tension, it won't. Buckling is the phenomenon. If you push both the ends very hard, you can imagine that at some point this kind of shape will come. It will, that is called buckling. So here you can see the shape. This is the shape. So in tension, there is never any buckling. The buckling phenomenon is only relevant in case of compression. So that is why we are saying the top flange and the top part of the web might undergo local buckling, because that is where the compressive force is being applied. Okay. Another mode of failure and beam which we are already familiar with from concrete design is shear. So shear generally exists in portions near to the supports. Where there very large shear exists. In this case, the beam may fail in shear if the web is not sufficient in thickness, and formation of plastering accompanies this process. So basically, what happens is, suppose this is a simply supported beam. Firstly, one another thing I said is that the horizontal parts generally take most of the bending, and the vertical part, the web, takes most of the shear. So if there is a shear failure in a steel section, it's generally because the web has failed. Because I am not expecting the flange to undertake the shear anyway. So what? Oh, yeah. So this is another important concept which you need to have an intuition of, that in a structure, what happens is that when a structure is loaded, a structure is a combination of a lot of elements. So if one element cannot take that load, what it does automatically is transfer the load to someone else. So the slab, what the slab on which you are sitting on, like your bed or chair is sitting on, the slab transfers the load to the beam. The beam transfers the load to the column. The column transfers it to the soil, like to the foundation, then to the soil. So now if the beam, that is suppose one of the beams which is holding up the slab, if that beam thinks that, like not thinks that, but if it is about to fail, what if the demand on it is greater than its strength, it won't fail. First of all, first it will try to undergo a load redistribution, and do it such that that so much force does not come on that beam at all, and maybe the slab could transfer more load to the other beams, and the load could still get dissipated to the soil somehow. So what happens in the case of flange, the flange wave structure is that the flange cannot take shear. So the shear entirely goes to the web itself. It's not that since the flange cannot take shear, if the shear force comes, the flange will immediately fail. The flange will give it to the web. And similarly for bending, since the flange has much higher bending capacity than the web, when the beam is undergoing bending, the flange takes most of the bending. Now, if the flanges also fail, that is, if the flanges fail in bending, or if the web fails in shear, that's when the beam will actually fail. This load distribution is a very important intuitive concept for structural engineering. So okay, and why is shear greater near the supports? You would have learned basic bending moment and shear force diagrams, of course, in second year or something. So generally during the, like, imagine a cantilever beam with a load at the tip. The shear force increases gradually towards the support. The shear is maximum at the support. So generally, bending failure occurs at in a, for a simply supported the beam, the bending failure will occur at the center, and the shear failure will occur at the supports, because that the bending moment diagram peaks at the center, and the shear force diagram peaks at the supports. So that's where we have to, like, the critical, see, the length of the beam is like this, but the critical shear for against which I will design the beam is generally the shear which I'm expected to be developed at the supports. Another mode of failure in beam is shear buckling. Shear buckling is during the shearing process. If the web is too thin, then it is prone to get failed by buckling. So, see, the web itself might undergo compressive failure, and it might undergo buckling failure. They are different. Generally, compressive failure occurs in the term of crushing, like for concrete. If a concrete beam fails in compression, that means it will be the crushing kind of thing. The column's height will reduce, and it is going to collapse. But that can happen for steel beams as well. So this shear mode of failure is when the web fails in compression, and the shear buckling it when it fails by buckling. So the source is the shear, but the modes of failure are different. So there are two different design criteria: one for compressive failure, one for buckling failure. We'll look into that later. So shear buckling occurs when, due to shear, the web has a buckling kind of thing. Web crushing and buckling. Web crushing and buckling, because very high vertical stresses act on support and at locational load points, the beam web may get failed by crushing or buckling as shown. So okay, this is another thing. So here what's happening is that the web is this shear buckling and this web crushing and buckling are occurring at different things. Okay, so when the shear what happens is, this is the web, and this buckles like this. So this is the web crushing and buckling, that is also due to shear. And this, it's a little difficult to explain, but it buckles along the length, like it's along the length, I think it is buckling. So it's a little difficult to visualize unless you actually see these structures. But there are different design criteria in IS 800, which we will go step by step when we are looking into the design of beams. Lateral torsional buckling. This type of failure occurs when the beam has high flexural stiffness in the vertical plane as compared to the horizontal plane. So the vertical plane is this, the gravity plane, and the horizontal plane is this. So if when a bending is wait, a bending moment is being generated in the beam, so this if the flexural stiffness in the vertical plane is very high, so this is basically bending in the vertical plane. Okay, this kind of this is bending in the vertical plane. So now if the strength of the beam is high in this plane, this bending is not going to cause any trouble. But the bending in the horizontal direction, if the bending stiffness is less, what happens is it buckles along the beam, along the length of the beam. It buckles like this diagram. You can see that this is the root of the cantilever, this is the end of the cantilever, there is a load. So the beam was supposed to be like this, straight. So this bending did not cause any trouble, but it bended like this. So this is called lateral torsional buckling. For example, a loaded cantilever is shown. It will deflect and twist in the sideways direction. When this beam is prevented from deflecting sideways by a force floor or slab construction, the beam is torsionally restrained. It is essential to check the stability of the beam in the lateral direction also. And we will see during the design of beams that laterally restrained and laterally unrestrained beams have different design criteria. So whether that depends on whether that is because we have to consider the lateral torsional buckling in one, and in the other it is restricted. Okay, so far all the modes that we were seeing, the bending, local buckling, shear buckling, web pressing and buckling, and lateral torsional buckling. All of these were collapse limit states. Like if these limit states are violated, limit state being violated means that the developed force or the developed stress becomes higher than the stress capacity of the structure of my material. So that means it will lead to a collapse, a breakdown kind of thing. So all of these were ultimate or collapse limit states, and the other kind of limit states are the serviceability limit states, which have to do with deflection. So deflection, it is quite practical that a beam may not fail due to excessive deflection, but on the other hand, too much deflection can lead to discomfort to the occupants along with stripping of flooring, finishes, etc. So this is like deflection seems to be a lesser, like deflection is actually a less serious mode of failure than the collapse limit states, because if it fails, like if a structure collapses, of course the worst damage to life and properties is going to happen. But deflection is also a criteria, so there are some upper limits to maximum deflection that I'm going to allow in a beam, in a column, in all the structural elements. And that is because deflection, too much deflection, firstly it might, like if you see a beam hanging like this, even if the beam has not collapsed, as residents we will think that there something is going to happen, so we are going to call the, like we are going to call someone to repair it anyway. So that is, in the residential buildings, that is not going to serve its purpose. And then there are flooring and finishes can, because the floors, the tiles and all are not actually structural elements. Like a structural element is something that is expected to take a load. So the flooring finishes, these things are not expected to take a load. So if there is some, so they are not actually designed, they are just placed on top of the, so now the slab, if the slab bends ridiculously, or if it deflects a lot, there might be damaging to the flooring. And in case of industrial structures, especially in mechanical industries or civil engineering industries, the excessive deflection might hamper the movement of equipment. In parking lots, excessive deflection might create difficulties in the headroom requirement. So deflection is also a criteria that we have to consider, even if it is not as serious as the collapse limit states. Okay, now we have looked at the modes of failure. Now we look at the loads, which is which are like loads is what we are designing the structure against. So loads are, these are the forces that acts on a structure. Loads are in fact action on a structure due to which the structure responds. That is reaction. So the reaction causes the stresses and strains in the structure. Load is action. This action acting on the structure may either be direct action or indirect action. So, direct action. These loads act directly on the structure and include dead loads, live loads, snow load, wind load. Dead load is the self weight of the structure. Live load is the furniture and the human beings moving on, like all that movable thing. Furniture is also live load. Sometimes furniture is like mistaken to be dead load, but it is not. Dead load is just the self weight of the structure. And The snow load is not relevant in India. Wind loading is, especially in case of like, especially near the coast where the wind is high, or especially in high altitude structures. The intensity of these direct actions have been described by various codes or standards. Like in India, we have IS 875 Part 1. See, IS 875 Part 1 describes live dead load. Part 2 describes live load. Part 3 describes wind load, and then snow load and various possible load combinations in the part 5. And IS 1893 is for the earthquake load. So these are all direct actions. Earthquake loading is very important. Like the because India has several high risk earthquake zones. So we generally design it against dead, live, wind load, and earthquake loads. Then there are some indirect actions in like sometimes load act on a structure indirectly due to temperature change, settlements, deformations, etc. These indirect loads also need to be taken into account. So now there is something called fire resistant design. Okay, so in case there is a fire, we would not like the entire structure to collapse completely. So in steel, it is a so it's still is it's and actually like the temperature part is an issue because it has a quite a high expansion of coefficient of thermal expansion. So we would think that if the temperature increases by this amount, there could be some strain in the structure, then some stress. So we would like to take that into account. And settlement is something, settlement of foundation. Suppose the foundation settles to some extent, we don't know what the conditions will be. There will be some rules in our IS codes. We cannot just take it from our head that this much is going to settle and all. But if there is settlement in the foundation, suppose there is a little bit of uneven settlement, so one side settles more, one side settles a little less, then the slabs and the beams on top will undergo some kind of bending load. So these are the indirect actions that induce some stresses and strains in the structure, just like the direct actions do. So we also take them into account. And reactions due to action on structure. As per the limit state method of design, the structure is required to satisfy the limit state of serviceability as well as the limit state of collapse. A structure needs to be assessed for the effects of design loads, actions, including its individual members and connections. So this analysis is done either by using elastic or the plastic method of analysis. This we look into later. And now we come to the design philosophies. Design of steel structures. Errors and uncertainties get involved in precisely assessing the probable loads that will act on the structure and the structural behavior of materials. So this is uncertainty. So uncertainty quantification is actually a research area in civil engineering. That's what I work on as well in my PhD. Uncertainty quantification, because it is so important, because firstly the loads are completely uncertain. You can clearly imagine that, because we don't know when a wind load is going to come, when a fatal wind load, when an earthquake is going to come. All of that is some kind of prediction is involved. Climate changes has some kind of predictions involved. And even the material that we are getting, suppose the factory sells a structural engineer some steel section saying this is Fe 410. So the yield stress is supposed to be 250. But what if there was some error in the manufacture itself? So the exact dimension might not be what I expected. The exact strength might not be what I expected. So there is always a factor of there is a factor of uncertainty which we cannot really ignore in civil engineering design. So the various structural design requirement criteria relate to the corresponding limit states, and they also have an inherent safety requirement. So you know that there are factors of safety which are applied on the loads and the materials. Why do we do that? It is not a yes or no thing. It is not that if I put this it is safe, if I don't put this it's not safe. It's basically it is introducing an inherent safety level. There are some kinds of indicators which say how safe a structure is. There are some indices called the reliability index. There is one common called reliability index. So this is a detour from design of steel structures, because in when you are doing design of steel structures, you are basically just going to have to follow the code. But this is a piece of information I'm giving you, that the Indian standard codes have an inherent reliability. Reliability is is a measure of safety of the structure incorporated into it, and similarly, all the codes around the world also have some safety incorporated into it. So the various structural design requirement criteria relate to corresponding limit states, and thus the design of structure to comply with all essential requirements may be called limit state of design. There are two design criteria: the strength design criteria and the stiffness design criteria. The strength design criteria is related to the possible modes of failure of a structure due to overloading and or under strength conditions. So all the bending, shear, buckling, all of those modes were the strength design criteria. These design criteria are concerned with yielding, buckling, fatigue, brittle fracture, corrosion. The major design philosophies under these criteria are the working stress method, ultimate load method, and the limit state method. So this ultimate load method, I think Indian standards have not really used, but up to a long time, like last century itself, working stress method was most relevant. But then the codes were all revised to make it adaptable to limit state method. But there are some structures like uncracked design of water tanks, I think that still follows a working stress method. So it is not like the working stress method has completely been removed. You can see even in IS 800 most of the design is in keeping with the limit state method, but at the end a few pages will be dedicated to working stress method anyway. And stiffness, so it's not like the working stress method is wrong, okay. Both of these methods have their own merits, and we have chosen the limit state method because it generally leads to more economically viable structures, but this working stress method is also allowable. Okay, and then there's the stiffness design criteria. So what is stiffness? Firstly, you have to be very clear about what is strength and what is stiffness. Strength is the in the stress strain curve. The strength is the y-axis, the stress. So when the stress developed in a structure exceeds its yield stress, it yields. When the stress developed in a structure exceeds the ultimate stress, it fails. That is a strength. And stiffness is the basically the in spring, stiffness is force per unit displacement. So it is basically the slope of the stress strain curve, and the stiffness relates to how much strain is going to be developed in the structure. That is why the ultimate or collapse limit states are the strength design criteria, and the serviceability limit states are the stiffness design criteria. These design criteria are related to the serviceability of a structure under working loads and are prominently concerned with ensuring that structure has sufficient stiffness that may otherwise lead to excessive deformations, including deflections, distortion, sagging, etc. Working stress method. Now we'll look at the two basic design philosophies. Though we'll stick to the limit state method, it is worth knowing about the working stress method philosophy as well. The working stress method is a design approach in civil engineering for the intricate analysis and design of reinforced concrete structures. The theory is based on the idea of computing stresses and strains in the structure as a result of applied loads. The working stress method operates under the assumption that both concrete and steel display linear elastic behavior, where the stresses directly correlate with their corresponding strains. So let's go back to the stress strain curve to see what this implies actually. So working stress method is going to only let us work in this zone, this zero to A part, like this origin to A part. Up to C or D, it generally applies up to the yield strength, but you can see this is a very small zone. So A is the elastic limit. If, sorry, A is the linearity limit that after which the Hooke's law is not followed, and the yielding comes quite immediately afterwards. So this is where the working stress method limits itself. That if the structure yields, it has failed. So that is kind of underutilizing the structure's capacity, but that is the philosophy here. And it of course makes the structure more safe because you are just assuming that the steel has only a strength of 250. So if you underestimate the strength of the material, then you are actually making the structure safer. Then, in this manner, the allowable stress values for concrete and steel are ascertained by considering the factor of safety. This factor of safety acts as a safeguard, accommodating the various uncertainties in material properties, construction techniques, and other influential variables. Advantages: the working stress method is relatively simple to understand and apply, making it accessible to engineers and designers, and especially laymen who just don't have a very good, like diploma engineers. I mean, I'm not saying that they are laymen, but it's like diploma engineering has a smaller coursework compared to civil engineers, like the BTech, the bachelor's thing. So diploma engineers can also, like, since the working stress method is very like accessible, anyone with a much lesser knowledge can execute it. It has been widely used for many years and it is well known among engineers and construction professionals. So this is also important because see, people are, especially in India, you know that there are so many other stakeholders in any project. So you are employing the same promoter who has been building for 30 years, who has been building, like, has been doing building projects for 30 years. So he has a set of, they have a set of like estimations where they are very they are very reluctant to move to a new method. So since this method is well known among engineering and construction professionals, people are reluctant to move on from it. So working stress method is still demanded from engineers in various projects. The method is generally conservative in nature, which means it tends to result in safer designs by considering lower allowable stresses. That is what I said. If you underestimate the structural strength and if you overestimate the load, you are going to end up with a safer design, and of course, a less economical design. It allows for easy comparison of the design with permissible limits, ensuring that the structure stays within safe limits. By using this method, engineers can achieve economical designs by optimizing the use of materials while adhering to safety standards. The working stress method can be easily integrated with IS codes and standards because the oldest and first IS codes followed this method. It is particularly suitable for designing simple and common structural elements like beams, columns, and slabs. The method is often based on empirical data and real world experience, making it reliable in practical applications. Now, in civil engineering, time is always a safety. Like we feel that if a structure, like suppose all the bridges that has been constructed in India during or before independence, a lot of them are still standing, and they were built based on the working stress method, right? So we know that those bridges have stood for almost 100 years, so they are bound to be doing something correctly. So since they have stood the test of time, we tend to trust them more. The analysis required for this method is often less complex than other advanced methods, making it feasible for smaller projects or situations where advanced analysis isn't necessary. The method's long history, yeah, this is what I said. The method's long history of use in engineering practice attests to its reliability and effectiveness. There are some disadvantages. The method doesn't fully consider the elastic behavior of the material, so which can lead to potential underestimation of stress concentration and structural deformations. While conservatism is a merit, conservatism means more priority to safety. It can also be a demerit since it might result in over-designed structures, leading to increased material and construction costs. So now, suppose just in simple example, if you assume the concrete, suppose that's just a concrete element, concrete beam. If I assume that its yield stress is 100, and then if I assume it is 200, if I assume it is 100, I'm going to end up with a larger cross section, right? So that is where that is what is called over design, because maybe the section can take up to 200, but I am saying that no, I'm going to assume it only takes 100, so I'm going to end up with a larger design, and that is over design structure, which leads to increased material and construction costs. The method's reliance on allowable stresses can make it sensitive to variations in material properties, potentially leading to inconsistencies in design. It is unsuitable for complex structures and situations involving non-linear behavior, dynamic loads, or unique loading conditions. Because it is we are oversimplifying the problem so much. We are just saying that the stress and strain is going to have a linear relationship. So then, if it goes into the non-linear regime, we don't know what working stress method does not know what to do. Dynamic loads means time varying loads. So earthquake loading is a dynamic loading. It is not really practical. None of these non-linear behavior, dynamic loadings, or different loading conditions, none of it we can actually guarantee that it is just going to stay in the linear elastic regime. So it is a very oversimplified method. So if you go for complex structures, you have to think beyond that. De- Depending solely on allowable stress limits might not provide adequate safety margins for modern construction practices, which often involve diverse and dynamic loads. The method might not adequately address the effects of multiple simultaneous loads, which are common in real world scenarios. It doesn't consider the redistribution of stress after structure yields, which can lead to localized failure. So this is an implication of assuming that all the structural elements can only take up to the yield stress. So in case the structure does yield, in case one element does yield, so what? So suppose there are two elements, two like a beam and a column. For working stress method, I'm going to assume that if this beam yields, it's going to fail. It is going to just disappear. If we see if a structural element fails, we can assume that it is not there in the structure anymore because it is not going to take any more load. So if I'm assuming that this beam yields, it disappears, then the column does not have any particular loading right now from that beam. But in reality, the beam does not actually fail when it's yield. When it yields, when it fails, when it yields, it still has some stress. It is still transferring some load to the column. So that is a real world behavior. So in The thing is that working stress method generally leads to more conservative design, but some places it also, by underestimating the strength or and behavior of some structure, it might actually overestimate the strength of another structure, and that may lead to localized failure. The method might not effectively account for the properties of advanced materials that exhibit nonlinear behavior, such as fiber reinforced composites. The method doesn't consider time dependent effects like creep and shrinkage, which can impact long term structural performance. This is why the like lifetime of a structure is mentioned, because there are some time dependent effects which we have to take into account. And then we move to the limit state method. This limit state method of design considers all relevant conditions pertaining to limit states of strength and serviceability. The strength limit states are based on load carrying capacity of structure, which includes buckling, fatigue, fracture, etc. Serviceability limit states are based on performance of the structure under actual application of service loads and includes deflection, vibration, corrosion, ponding, etc. The loads at working conditions are factored by the use of partial safety factors for loads, resulting in factored loads or design loads. And the normal strength of the material is called as the ultimate capacity, and the corresponding design strength of the material is obtained by dividing the ultimate capacity by the partial safety factor. So the limit state that has to be satisfied is that the design action should be less than the design strength. So, just for an example, suppose I am assuming a load, there's a design load from my wind load calculations, I get 10 kilonewton. Then I'm going to, that is the one working load. Then I'm going to apply a factor of safety multiplicative with this load. So I'm suppose 1.5, which is a common safety of factor of safety for dead loads. 1.5 into 10, 15 kilonewton. So I'm going to assume that I have to design the structure against 15 kilonewton. And then the design strength, the yield stress of steel is 250 MPa. I'm going to put a factor of safety in the denominator. So 1.1 or something. I'm going to bring it down. So I'm going to assume that. So I'm going to overestimate the load a little bit. I'm going to underestimate the strength a little bit. But the strength is not limited to the yield strength. Okay, that is where this method is more like better than the working stress method, because working stress method limits the strength of the material to the yield stress, while the limit state method allows it up to the ultimate capacity. So sorry, I shouldn't have said 250, I should have said 410. So the ultimate capacity of my material is 410. That is where I apply the factor of safety in the denominator. So I am including some safety factor. 410 divided by 1.1 is 370, with that is still much greater than 250, right? In working stress I'm going to limit it up to 250. Here I'm allowing up to 370, and still there is some safety margin there. And for the load also there is a safety margin, because we are assuming a greater load than I'm actually expecting. So the design action should be less than the design strength. This is the limit state that must be satisfied. Being satisfied means that the design strength is greater than the design action. That means my structure is safe. And if the limit state is violated, that is the design action, or the action becomes greater than the strength, that is when the structure will go close to failure. Advantages: this method recognizes that design parameters are variants. This method logically deals with the fact that there is always a possibility of variations in loads and material properties. That is why the uncertainty quantification, reliability, these studies have been incorporated into limit state design. So the factor of safety is actually accounts for this possibility of variations, or the coefficient of variation. This method gives different weightages to different loads and materials. So yes, the factor of safety of on load and below and the denominator of materials are not all same. In the design codes, you will find those factor of safety where you have to take something. So dead load my I think has 1.5, wind live load has 1.2. So these factor of safeties have been due to research on the general variability that I'm expecting on that kind of loads. So I'm not just giving a blanket factor of safety for all kinds of loads. It is tailor made to account for the particular load I'm considering. There has been a lot of research work going behind this. So the research comes first, and then the codes have the IS codes are a step-by-step kind of design tool which anyone can use even without knowing the background, but that the research components are actually incorporated or embedded in the material in this the methods automatically. One example of that is that the different factor of safeties for different loads and materials. Disadvantage: there is a likelihood of design errors because of the more complex theory, which are not so in working stress method of design. Like anything is more difficult to apply, then the chance of error increases. Limit state method. This is not a disadvantage. Limited method of design is still far better than other design philosophies. That is why almost all codes around the world now follow it. IS 800 2007 is a design code for steel structures, which is based on limit state method of design. However, it still maintains a working state design approach. So near the end, you will find some appendix or something, so one chapter on working state design approach. Design load in limit state method is obtained by multiplying the working load by with the partial factor of safety, and the resulting load is called the factored load or the design load. Different design loads, like, for example, dead load, live load, wind load, earthquake loads, are then combined under the most severe but realistic conditions. So we don't just design the structure against dead load, live load separately, because live load, and wind load, dead load and live load will always occur together. And wind load and earthquake load, when it comes, it is not only the earthquake load being applied on the structure. The dead load and live load is still there. So there are also some load combinations which are also there in the IS 875, like IS 875 part 5 has the load combinations. So you need, like, to become a structural design engineer, you need knowledge of all of those codes especially. And the design strength of the material is obtained by dividing the characteristic strength of the material by a suitable partial factor of safety. The design strength of each material and their connections must be such that the most severe combination of design loads must not cause failure. So the most critical limit state will be where the load combination is the design load is maximum. So I will want the design strength of each material, that it will withstand that worst load combination as well. It must also be ensured that the structure is stable against overturning, sway, etc. So there are some stability criteria which generally are automatically incorporated if we are designing it against strength. Okay, so these were the basic design philosophies of steel design and design in general. Are there any questions? Okay, if you have no questions, you can leave. I'll wait for 5 more minutes. Send what? Send the presentation. Okay, so I attached that link to the class last year. All the presentations of this course are uploaded here. One of the 12 weeks, so you can access them here.
Hello.
Yes.
Ma'am, actually, you told you will share the video link.
Um,
YouTube link. YouTube link.
I cannot hear what you're saying. Can you write in chat box?
Uh,
Yes, yes.
you told actually you will share the video link. This video.
Okay, okay, yes. Well, so now I haven't uploaded it yet. But
You just share the playlist. We will
hmm.
your channel. Your channel. We will
Yes.
watch the complete.
How exactly do I share it? Can you check if you can access it with this link?
Okay, we will check.
Please discuss partial safety factor for loads and materials. So, see these the concept of these partial safety factors of load and material is that there will be the they are accounting for the uncertainties that I'm expecting in the structure. Like uncertainties, firstly we are expecting a certain value of the load, certain value of the strength. Then I know there will be some then I accept there will be some uncertainty, so I have to put some factor of safety. And the magnitude of that factor of safety will depend on a lot of statistical study of the past, like statistical, all of these strength materials, the loads, everything follows some statistical distribution. Like the strengths I think are generally assumed to follow a Gaussian distribution, normal distribution. So the it will have a mean, which is the strength, which is the actual strength. It will have some standard deviation, and the loads are generally assumed to follow distributions, some extreme value distributions like Weibull, Gumbel, Frechet. So there are some extreme value distributions. These are statistical studies. Okay, so we don't, as civil engineers, we don't have to go into details of that. But what we have is that the IS codes have lists of factor of safety that must be used under different conditions. So for dead load, I'm going to use this. For live load, I'm going to use this. For this load combination, I'm going to use this factor of safety. Then for steel, for bending, I'm going to use certain factor of safety. For shear, I might have to use a different factor of safety. And all of this will be mentioned in the IS code, IS design code. If you scroll down that part, you will see that in the formula there will be some factor of safety in the denominator, and you will find the values also listed immediately afterwards. Is that okay? Okay.
Hi, ma'am. Actually, this week, week two is full of both the design, right? But uh, week two lecture is about the bolt design.
Bolt design.
Bolt design.
Okay,
Yes.
okay. I actually had the NPTEL PTA-ship design structure. Then the second week was about design philosophies. I'll go into bolt design next class. Bolts and welds, I think in week 3 and 4.
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, is it calculator required for the exam?
What?
Calculator.
Calculator allowed for the exam, I'm not sure about that, but I think it should be because the gate examination and all that allows calculator. Generally, in all exams, in all civil engineering exams, we are allowed calculators. I think it should be allowed. You should mail the NPTEL the team once and confirm. But it's very impractical to
Will
think.
you give me the NPTEL mail ID?
Oh, okay. Let me see. And I'm not sure exactly what to use. Yes, there is an email ID here.
Okay, ma'am.
Calculator cannot be used. Okay, that's weird because we use it everywhere. But okay, if it cannot be used, then you have to. Then I guess the calculations won't be that difficult.
Then what about code book, ma'am? Code book we can take or no?
Codebook you won't be allowed. Codebook, I mean, you won't be allowed to carry it to the exam center because you are not allowed anything from outside in an exam. But some formula might be given. That depends on the questions, really. I mean, you're generally not expected to remember a lot of stuff except some basic formula. When we go into the bolt design, I'll tell you which formula you need to remember, and that you automatically will remember after a few problem solvings. But you're not expected to remember all the formulas. They are generally provided.
Ma'am, now in our company we are doing cold forming connection designs.
Hmm.
Is there any specific software? Because we don't have any software to do the connection design. But a hot roll we do. We have one software for hot roll.
Okay, no,
Is there any software or can
I'm
I?
actually not sure of that. I have never worked in the industry myself, so
Okay, ma'am. I'm asking, shall we use the same software, hot roll, whatever the hot roll? The code will be different. Actually, 801 is the cold forming
see
code.
the software like STAD, ETABS, they have the Indian code incorporated into it. The design is completely dependent on the design codes. Like the design philosophies are same. The design philosophy might be standard, but it has those all the safety factors and all that you have to incorporate, but the formula that we follow in the code is incorporated into those software as far as I know. So I think that for hot roll and cold roll you cannot use the exact same software. It might be some like some changes, some options, there might be some options, but generally it should not be same. I think so, I'm not 100% sure. You see, these the courses that we study in college, and all these courses are basically the theoretical part of it. For the practical part, it actually needs a lot more work in after when you actually get into working. Uh, that experience and all that is a completely different matter. That is why the starting salary of civil engineers is very less, because when you have done the courses theoretically, we don't really have a good knowledge about what is practical, what we actually have to do. Because here we are learning the design of a beam, a connection, but in reality we have to build the entire structures. That is a whole different thing. For that, these we need as basic knowledge, but it is not enough. Okay, then we'll meet next Tuesday. And we'll look at bolt design, buckling. Okay, you want to wait 1 second. I'll try something to visualize it. Just imagine a sheet of paper. Okay, can you see this? Okay, so suppose this is a column or something. Suppose this is a cross section and this is the length. And if you apply a compressive load, this phenomenon that is happening, it's bending. It is bending in this frame. This is basically what buckling is. So if you take a very tall, thin kind of structure and you apply a compressive load, if you increase the compressive load, you will see automatically it undergoes a buckling kind of thing. So like that is called, whatever it undergoes like this, that is called buckling. That is something you have to visualize. You imagining a paper or a straw or something. That is the intuition.
What is the difference between slenderness and buckling now?
What difference between slenderness and buckling?
Yes.
Slenderness is a property of a cross section. So slenderness is not a material property; it's a geometric property. So slenderness ratio has to do with the length and the cross sectional dimensions. And that is a slenderness is the property of the structure. Is It's a physical qualitative property. Slenderness ratio is the quantitative property of the cross section, and buckling is a phenomenon that is a risk in slender structures. So if the slenderness ratio crosses a certain limit, I have to assume that buckling is a viable mode of failure. So I have to include buckling mode in my design criteria. So I have to assume that it can buckle. So this is another extra equation basically. Like in beam design, we use bending and shear equations. Here we have to use a buckling equation as well if the slenderness ratio crosses a certain limit. They are not different. They are different things, but they are related.
But slenderness ratio is the formula of L by R, correct? The radius of gyration, correct?
Radius of gyration is a property of a cross section. It's a completely different thing.
Uh, Radius of gyration is it depends upon the cross section, correct? If the cross section increases, the radius of gyration
Exactly.
increase like that, correct?
Yes, yes, yes. That's
Okay.
why I said the length and the cross sectional dimensions both are important in the slenderness ratio.
Ma'am, actually, if we construct actually we are doing one project in our office that we are constructing modular hotels that is full of steels. There we are using the cold form. Actually, what is the advantage of using the steel instead of reinforced concrete in terms of cost?
Cost is, I mean, concrete steel is of course costlier than concrete. You would have, if you are working in office, you would know that. But steel, the but steel also has some advantages like the strength to weight ratio is high, so it might be that ultimately like same amount of steel will cost you more than same amount of concrete. But the steel has much, like a less amount of steel can provide a larger strength. So maybe in the particular structure that is being constructed, steel is more economical here because lesser amount is going to suffice and the overall cost is maybe going to reduce. And even if the overall cost is going to increase a little bit, maybe there are some other criteria like this, like safety is an important criteria, then there is some like provision of materials, construction industry, everything is involved in the construction process. It's not that if you are constructing a steel building, it's always that it is safer, it is more, it is cheaper. Everything might not be happening. There might be a lot of other factors involved.
Madam, a
Hmm.
residential steel building, actually it is a composite structure. Is it
Okay. Composite
uh,
of?
composite concrete and steel, both
Yes, yes,
combined?
yes, yes.
Actually, only steel structure in residential purpose not possible.
Is very rare. Yes, it is not cost viable because residential structures have lesser economic return than institutional structures.
Actually, in our company, the UK client is modular construction. They are usually doing model box type structure, which is they are fabricating in the factory and they are lifting it and taking it through the roads and fixing it above the concrete. Concrete below the ground floor only concrete. The above floors are modular boxes. Like that, they are doing in the UK. They are implementing the same in India. They are trying to.
Oh, okay, okay. I don't know much about all this.
Um, Ma'am, actually, I have another question. For example, if you are going for the steel constructions, only we need to follow the lateral. What about lateral load, ma'am? Lateral, we have to have the core walls, correct?
The what? Lateral, you have to have the what?
Core wall for the strength.
I didn't get what you said. Can you write in the chat box?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, I don't know this. Okay, I mean, I know the course in a very theoretical manner because, as I said, I've never worked in the industry. I know what we need to learn the theoretical basis and all that. I'm sorry, I can't help you with this. Okay. We'll meet next Tuesday then with Bolt Design. Okay, I'm ending the class then. See you next Tuesday.